Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode. We are continuing our journey this week with art and ideology, and this particular episode is piggying back on the first episode we had, which was just a general introduction to what is ideology, how do art objects, how does visual culture in general use ideology for different persuasive purposes. And today we are thinking about specifically this thing called appropriation. And if we're thinking about art and orienting ourselves in art, which is what we're doing in this class, but also thinking about our unit on ways of seeing, that appropriation is essentially about circulation. It's about mediation of ideas. So if you remember, ideology means the study of ideas, the study of concepts. But those are not stable things. They are meant to circulate amongst different communities, different people, different regions, forever. They circulate endlessly, especially now with digital media. Things move very, very fast, and today we are really going to think about that. What happens when ideologies pass and are transferred through different contexts, different cultures, and then parts of that ideology are then appropriated, right? They're used and reused in something new, right? And so we're going to think about this process of appropriation as a type of circulation of ideologies, and they could be very different ideologies. It is very much about context. We have to really think about where the connection's happening, what's circulating, and what's coming out of it. And so the goal of today is to walk us through some visual examples of appropriation and talk about it cross-historically and and globally. So you will, by the end of this lecture, be able to answer the following questions. What is appropriation? What do we mean by appropriation when we're thinking about art and visual culture? How do different cultures circulate visual culture, right? And not only amongst themselves, but with different regions and peoples too. Next, a very important part of thinking about appropriation is, well, what is cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation, right? So maybe some of you have heard the term cultural appropriation, which has negative connotations. And so part of it, we'll comment and we'll pause a bit and think about, well, what is appropriation that is paying homage to what it's circulating, the culture or and the context in which it comes from? What is the difference between appreciating it and reusing it from that side versus cultural appropriation, which we consider it's not paying homage in a certain way? And so we'll talk about that later on. Lastly, how has appropriation of marketing and consumerist imagery in particular shaped the nature of artistic production? So we're going to comment a little bit on the history of art, because this idea of appropriation becomes a hot point within art movements starting in the 1960s in the US and continues to this day. So we'll comment a little bit about that and its relation specifically to advertising and branding and marketing, which are already images, right, that are meant to circulate and be appropriated. So that's on the docket today. Let's get started. Okay, so what is appropriation? Appropriation, the definition, just the very brass tacks definition is the intentional, and that's important, it's intentional, not subconscious, intentional borrowing, copying, and altering of existing images and objects. And when we're thinking about ideology, it's always attached in some way, right? Images have meaning to the culture context in which it's been created. So when something is borrowed intentionally, you can add your own ideology to it, but that original ideology is somewhere there, right? And that is meaningful for why copy this image? Why borrow this image? Why alter this image? Appropriation, if we're thinking about the art in general, has been a strategy for millennia. And so the first examples I'm going to show you today are actually fairly far away. A long time ago, I'm going to show you how different cultures have appropriated imagery as a historical thing. But like I said, it took a huge part of the mindset of the mid 20th century, so 1960s, with the rise of mass media, with the rise of popular culture, with the rise of these kind of mechanisms of advertising that we live with so intimately now. In the 50s and 60s, that idea of marketing and branding and circulation in mass media outlets, from magazines to televisions, was just starting to ramp up. And so appropriation became a strong interest for artists living during that period. Today, appropriating happens all the time. To TikTokers sample or remix other people's content, tagging them, paying homage to it. It's a key aspect of popular culture and a common practice for artists working in many different mediums. But it continues to be it's a strategy, continues to challenge notions of originality and authorship, right? When you sample something, there's always that discussion in your mind, or a discussion in the wider audience, of how much of it is original content, how much are you the author, right? This is where we can get into tricky legal disputes, right? On, well, how much did you sample? That is too much, right? And copyright laws are very specific about how much content needs to be original to be considered new and have a new authorship. And so often too, appropriation can blur the boundaries of, well, who owns what is original and who is the author, but it also blurs the boundary of what it means to be an artist. If we think about what we've talked about before, being an artist as this idea of originality, of this ingenious person who has unique ideas and has a unique persona. If you are sampling other people's work as part of your art, that challenges a little bit of that time-old notion of this originality, right? So we're going to be thinking about all these really interesting, meaty things today, looking at art. So let's get started. Okay, so I'm taking you back to circa 1347 current era, and we are going to China, Ming Dynasty China. And we are time traveling there to look at this wonderful hanging scroll ink painting by Wu Shen called Stalks of Bamboo by ARTH. And Wu Shen is considered one of the great ink painters in the Chinese tradition, right? And so why are we looking at this particular painting? Well, we're looking at it within the context of, well, why is this important? Why is Wu Shen painting this really atmospheric, very abstract, but also very detailed image of this bamboo, this lonely bamboo stalk by a rock? Well, during the time of its creation, the ink painting is a very high status in the Chinese arts, right? And but not so much, so not higher, right, than calligraphy, right? So the writing of the characters with your calligraphy brush with ink. And so you can see that Wu Shen here, he knows that calligraphy is considered the highest art that an artist could perfect and do. And then using ink painting as a way to come to that level as well. And so he has two different parts here. He has some calligraphy, right, which is very common with Chinese painting. Often this would be a meditation on what is being depicted. It also could be a dedication to someone, like I dedicate this to X, Y, and Z. Or it also could be a poem. It could be actual poetry about this scene that someone who would be looking at the hanging scroll would read and kind of think about. But if we're thinking about what he's trying to do, he's trying to elevate his painting to the high status of calligraphy. He's putting the bamboo stalk on there in a style that is very much in the style of those quick brush strokes that you would with writing in calligraphy. And he's putting them side by side, right? So if we're thinking about this work as perhaps a source of a type of appropriation, someone could sample some of the ideas behind what Wuxian is doing, right? I'm making a bamboo stalk that looks very much like a calligraphy character, and I'm blurring the boundaries to show my artistry, right? And to elevate painting. Well, Chinese ink painting was very popular for regions outside of China, in Korea and in Japan. And the example I'm going to show you is, the next example is from Japan by Sesu Toyo, another very famous ink painter for Japanese art history and culture. And Sesu Toyo actually studied and went to Japan to learn the tradition of ink painting, and in particular the tradition of Chinese ink painting. And he came back to Japan and used and appropriated, right, what he learned into his own practice. And so if you remember, we have the quick, these quick movements, right, of calligraphy, right, the quick character building, and then how that this bamboo stalk, you see the quick flick of the brush as it creates this botanical image. Well, Sesu Toyo really liked that idea of using ink with a brush in this quick motion. And that's called hoboku in Japanese. It's this splashed ink, right? In this quick movement. And to create something like this, Sesu Toyo would have to really think about what the image is supposed to be. What am I doing? This is a landscape, so where I need to think about, like, what am I depicting? What kind of landscape? Because ink, you have to work fairly quickly with ink. If you want to move the water around, because it will dry. And you also have to think about the concentration of the pigment itself. See how these are darker areas. These are areas where there is more ink on the brush, and in areas where it's a little lighter, and then it becomes a little more watercolory. Well, that's precisely so. There's more water. The pigment isn't as condensed, right? So you have to think about, well, how am I going to use my lights and darks to create this landscape? And we can see it, that this is a rock with this wonderful bushy tree set within maybe a waterscape. We don't know, but then perhaps there are mountains in the background. And so going to China, seeing this type of tradition, coming back, really liking this idea of the quick motion. But for Sesu Toyo, it's not about elevating, say, calligraphy to the level of painting. For him, it's, how do I translate, right? How do I appropriate that technique, but how, and that idea behind it, into a new context that fits me and that really works for me? And that has everything to do with Japanese Zen Buddhism, which is a very popular form of Buddhism in Japan. And for him, this quick movement that you have to plan, but it's very spontaneous. It's in the moment. Was very much related to how Zen Buddhists practice meditation, right? One of the ways, right? You have to intense contemplation, a lot of discipline, and spontaneity, right? Was part of how you meditate, right? So this painting is one part painting and part of visual culture and something very valued aesthetically, but it also is functional as a tool for practicing a particular set of spiritual beliefs, right? But you can see how something like Chinese calligraphy and painting can be appropriated by Sesutoyo because he likes certain aspects of it, and then places his own ideology, religious and spiritual ideology into it. And so you can see kind of the similarities between the two. Going back to Chinese painting, we also have a tradition of landscape painting that is very typical of landscapes within the ink painting tradition. And landscapes aren't just landscapes, right? There's a lot of symbolism that is part of a landscape such as this. Shenzhou, also a very famous ink painter, and this is the lofty Mount Lu. And Mount Lu exists, but this is not a accurate, quote unquote, naturalistic view, photographic image of Mount Lu. Mountains were very symbolic and almost fantastical. They were representing so much more than just a mountain, and thus they could be strange. They could swirl in different ways. And Shen Zhao made this painting as a homage to his mentor and teacher, which is very typical. Usually, you become a master painter yourself. You dedicate a painting to the person who gave you that knowledge and that skill. Venerating teachers and ancestors, very much part of Chinese culture. And so this is dedicated to his master, right? His mentor. And he actually places his mentor in this image. And I challenge you all to maybe pause the video and see if you can find where he put his teacher, because his teacher is somewhere here. I'll let you pause and come back. Okay, so hopefully you guys, maybe found the teacher. And if you honed in right here, you see this figure, a small figure in a robe, standing right underneath the river that is coming out of this waterfall. And you might be asking yourself, well, if this is supposed to be commemorating someone very important to the artist, that they are like saying, you gave me all of this skill, why make the person so small and all the way down here? Well, Shen Zhao is trying to equate something as monumental, something as huge, something as vast and grand as a lofty mountain to his teacher, right? The fact that he's so small relates, right? And right in the center of this mountain juxtaposes the immensity of the mountain, right? He's saying, look how impactful my mentor is, right? And so it's not about, it's inverting scale in a little bit, but saying that, like, you right down here are this lofty mountain that rises above you, and is an example of my artistry, which you really helped me gain. So the mountain is symbolic of veneration, of authority, of paying homage to someone who is, in your mind, greater than yourself, right? In X, Y, and Z way. Here, it's you are my mentor, right? I owe everything to you. So now, for thinking about, well, how could something like this be appropriated in a different context? And here is our mentor right here. Let's look at this wonderful painting. This painting made by the Italian painter Giuseppe Castellone, who painted this painting called Auspicious Objects in 1724 when he was a resident at the Chinese emperor's palace, right? So there was a lot of circulation of artists going to China and Japan and living there. And so he was a guest of the Chinese emperor. And so Giuseppe Castelloni's Chinese name was Lang Xining. He created this painting as a homage to the emperor. It was the emperor's birthday, and he wanted to paint something for the emperor as a gift. And you should probably right off the bat notice that he is painting in a style very similar to what is the tradition of landscape paintings in China. And he's using that, he's inspired by it, he's appropriating it. For what reason, right? To pay homage to the emperor. And so he's just like the landscapes of Shenzhou, it's full of symbolism. And so he calls it auspicious objects because it is full of auspicious symbols and objects. And auspicious is a word that means something that's favorable or good luck, symbolic of something. And so he has a couple in here. Here, the eagle, which is a very prominent center of the painting. He also has evergreen pines and rocks. So the eagle is an auspicious symbol for imperial status, courage, and military achievement. And the evergreens and pines and the rocks are auspicious symbols for long life. So he's painting this inspired by the style of Chinese painting. Look how vertical it is. Right? It's not a lofty Mount Lu, but this pine becomes extremely meandering upward, thrusting upward, this vertical, the very strong vertical axis that it is, and how it kind of very wistfully disappears in the background. Using the style, but with a twist, right? It's not exactly in the style of an ink painting. You can see where he's getting some of his Western European tradition in, with some of the detailing and the colors, right? But he has an eagle and he puts them in rocks to say, hey, it's your birthday, Emperor. I wish you long life. And I celebrate your strong military achievement, your power, your status, and this would be a really great gift to give him, right? But an example of a certain type of appropriation of a style of how to convey meaning and thinking about the audience that you're doing. And so you can see definitely how that inspiration took form. But we can also see too, maybe even we can make even another connection to Wu Shen in that strong, kind of verticality, right? Notice in Shenzhou that the landscape is pretty cluttered, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. But with Wu Shen using the simplicity of just using verticality in this setting that disappears, also incorporating that. And this is very different from how painters in Italy, in Europe, in Western Europe, were painting landscapes. So here, I just as a quick comparison to show you how influenced Castiglione is look how by Chinese painting, by looking at the difference, right? That the strong verticality is something we see very quintessentially in Chinese, in Japanese and Korean painting, versus the classical landscape in the Western European tradition is very horizontally based, right? Everything recedes horizontally into the distance, and it becomes very flat. And usually there's this sense that where there is this perspective, right? There's someone here lurking behind this bush that perhaps is part of the scene, and all that we see is what that imagined perspective is. Versus here we have isometric perspective, which I've talked about a little bit before, is that it has strong parallel lines, right? There's a line here, and I can actually use this right here. There's this. Notice how certain elements within the painting create these diagonal lines, right? And that's isometric perspective versus, we talked about how in landscape tradition we have, focal points that are leading us to a vanishing point. So there is some linear perspective here, but we also have atmospheric perspective. We're seeing the land through light, how light and sky and air typically do if you're looking at that kind of landscape. So warm colors in the front, cool colors in the back create sense of depth, right? We totally different style, but what isometric perspective does is it creates this kind of, pun intended, bird's eye view of our scene. We don't get a sense that we are anywhere. We're everywhere and nowhere at the same time looking at this wonderful eagle, versus we get a sense of being situated probably somewhere right here in the space, and that we could actually walk and then move through. So let's look at just one more example of a kind of appropriation that we see in art history, and a little bit more modern, coming into the modern day. And we're in Japan, and we're looking at a woodblock print, which is a type of printmaking technique. It's a relief printmaking technique where you actually carve into a wood block, and everything that you carve out is empty space, and everything that stays gets inked, and that is the line. And you can build color with woodblock. It's a really wonderful technique. So that's what we're looking at. But what's really useful about printing in woodblock prints and with Japanese history is that they can be reproduced, right? So a painting like this is a one-off, right? It exists as itself. It can't be reproduced unless it's photographed. But if you don't have photography, because we're in 1795, if you want to reproduce an image, printing is a great way of doing that. And this style of print was called ukiyo-e, which means pictures of the floating world, which is kind of in reference to that isometric perspective again, right? We have this bird's eye view of this wonderful woman applying cosmetics to her face and looking in this glass. We get a sense of where are we? We're just kind of floating up in space, and we see everything at the same time. And so ukiyo-e became popular during the Edo period in Japan, because this is the period when Japan was really entering into Western European capitalist markets. And there was an encouraging trade with Europe, and there was a big boost in the middle class in Japan who could afford art, right? Who couldn't really afford painting like this, but they wanted painting, they wanted art, and so these prints were cheaper, right? Because you could reproduce them and sell them to a very large market. And in particular, ukiyo-e usually depicts scenes like this, scenes of everyday life, everyday city life. We don't have a lot of cities, views of marketplaces, things that a middle class audience would really want to buy. They would want to see images of their own life or the life that they know, versus say an image created for an emperor or some sort of priest or whatever. And so going to this modernization that Japan was going through during the Edo period, really aligned with changes and shifts in some sects of European artistry. So in 1854, a treaty was signed between Japan and the US. And up until then, Japan and its culture was fairly isolated from the Western world, like I said. But as soon as the markets were opened up, if we're thinking about Europe, there was a flood of these ukiyo-e prints that were coming into the Japanese market and being exhibited in exhibitions. And so this is the first time that European artists were exposed to this type of printing, this type of image. And someone like Mary Cassatt, who is a female artist who's in the Impressionist school, she was very, very impacted by this. She actually saw an exhibition of these prints in Europe, and she's American, but she came back, and then she was very inspired by the prints such as this for her image of just a woman sealing a letter at her desk, probably in her parlor or her room. And why is Mary Cassatt is appropriating the isometric perspective, this blocky style. She's actually using, she was a painter, but she's using dry point, which is a type of, it's a type of printmaking. It's not relief printing, it's actually intaglio, which is a different process, but still using the same idea of reproduction and reproducibility, and also just a focus on just this everyday depiction of life. And for Mary Cassatt, her subject matter in painting and other media, she was very interested in the life of women, of everyday women. So she has a lot of images of motherhood, of domesticity, of different of traveling, right? These very everyday moments that aren't usually captured as for her audience, right? They weren't super popular. Usually the Impressionists were doing pictures of buildings and landscapes, right? Other things, not these quiet moments of women with their families. So something like this, she'd be inspired. She's appropriating the style and the idea and the medium because that really appeals to her own practice, and she kind of is putting her own spin on it. Which begs the question, what is cultural appreciation versus cultural appropriation, right? Where do we draw the line? What is cultural appropriation, and how does it affect what artists make? And this is something that, cultural appropriation is an issue that is very at the fore of a lot of discussions now. Especially coming into the Halloween season, there's always conversations about what kind of costumes are cultural appreciations versus cultural appropriation and actually harmful, and when does it come harmful to the original culture where these sort of things come from. And so what kind of questions, like who has the right to tell certain stories? Who has the right to convey certain ideologies? Can an author write a character that is different, that has a different ethnicity or sexual orientation or gender expression than they themselves have, right? Is that something that can be done? Can artists depict cultures and experiences not their own, right? As we've seen, with an example such as this, artists have been thinking about this for a really long time, but we have to think about, well, what is the line, right? And it is totally possible for artists, designers, writers to explore ideologies, themes, styles from cultures not their own. The question that has to be put in the mind is paying close attention to how they depict those cultures, bodies, experiences, right? So what is the root of that appropriation? And here I have a clear example of something that would be more in the realm of cultural appropriation versus cultural appreciation. And if anyone remembers the old Aunt Jemima brand of pancake and pancake syrup, if you're old like me, I remember it on the shelves. But you have the name Aunt Jemima, which had this image of this African American woman smiling, right? And some of the problems with this branding was that it was appropriating aspects of African American culture in a way that was very much about stereotyping, right? So this idea of this house maid, the maid, the smiling maid who always says yes, ma'am, who's called auntie in the house, even though they were hired as servants, right? Which is a history of plantation life and slavery. It's just a very stereotypical image of Black women that has circulated for a very long time in film and advertising. And so just fairly recently, in 2021, the Quaker Oats Company, which owns the brand Aunt Jemima, did a rebranding, a totally big rebranding. They kept some of the graphic, the font and the kind of just the look of the outside of the package, but they got away with the Aunt Jemima and the image. And this was a concerted effort by the company in realizing that appropriating these certain aspects of African American culture that are very stereotypical might actually be very harmful, right? Like they're thinking about like how are they addressing this image as a means to sell, right? To sell something, to sell breakfast food. It may not be the most beneficial way of circulating something like this. without, it's not circulating it without a certain level of criticality. Okay, so now we're just going to end this episode by just moving fast through some examples of how commercialism, right, and advertising and a certain shift in the 20th century really changed the way artists saw their art, and it had everything to do with appropriation, of that borrowing of images or objects to make art, which really began in the 20th century with Marcel Duchamp. And he was part of the movement called Dada, which was just a nonsensical word. And the whole idea was to use art to disrupt commonplace ideas. And so what he would do is he would make these sculptures using just things that he found or could buy, like a stool and a bicycle wheel, that if he manipulates it, he repurposes it in some way, that it somehow he has now made art, right? I mean, and that's and this is always the question during the time, is like, what is this? Is this art? You just basically fused two things that you bought together. Why is this art? Why not is it art? And that was the whole idea of, well, you know, the artist is living in a world where there's all these things being manufactured, right? That are being created for mass media. So the artist is actually saying, well, I can use that as a tool for my own art. I can rethink what art means. Art doesn't have to be original. Art doesn't have to be the genius of one person's mind. You can actually manipulate and appropriate the world around you and create new forms, and thus create new ideas about art in general. And I think a classic example, and the one that we're going to end with, is Andy Warhol, who, working in 1962, is not he's not part of Dada, because Dada was kind of very culturally centered within the kind of the early 1900s. But Andy Warhol, with pop art, right, which just means popular art, they were thinking about consumerism and mass media, and specifically the images and the objects and the goods, the products that were being sold by marketing. And you know, if you've watched Mad Men, that whole series is about this moment in New York when advertising really had its heyday, and marketing. And so this is Andy Warhol's famous soup cans, his Campbell's soup cans, where he hand painted each one of these in excruciating detail to mimic the exact advertising image of Campbell's soup that was circulating in magazines and on TV. And Andy Warhol stated that pop artists did images that everyone walking down the street would recognize in a split second. Comics, picnic tables, men's pants, celebrities, refrigerators, Coke bottles. So he wanted to make art that was familiar to an audience, right? So bringing art down to size, right? And a lot of people looked at this Warhol's cans and said, well, how is this original? How is this an example of authorship if you're just copying advertising and just and using an image that's so everyday, right? That what is unique and special about this? Well, it has everything to do with how the power of appropriation, right? That he appropriated everyday objects, everyday images, and he even made multiples, right? And why did he make multiples? Because he was mimicking what Campbell's soup looks like when it's staged in a grocery store. You know how they're stacked, and they still are today. They're kind of stacked on top of each other. So he's mimicking the experience of looking at these sort of buyable goods in a grocery store, but now it's on a gallery wall. So appropriating all these things to redefine what is art, what counts as art, what can be put in the museum, and what is an artist, right? So appropriation, we'll talk more about this type of idea later on in the course, but it is a great example of appropriation, especially this modern appropriation of popular culture, which we still do. We could probably think of examples of us doing the same thing, of using commonplace items as a method of conveying an ideology related to the original, but something that we put our own spin on.